The laughter echoed through the abandoned warehouse on 142nd Street with a kind of confidence that comes from numerical superiority and absolute certainty that violence favors the many over the one. 20 men wearing white robes stood in a semicircle around burning barrels that cast flickering shadows across walls covered in racist graffiti and threats painted in blood-red letters, promising to cleanse Harlem of every black business owner, every black numbers runner, every black person who dared to think they belonged in a neighborhood that these 20 Klansmen had decided needed to be reclaimed for white supremacy through systematic terror and coordinated violence. They had gathered on this Thursday evening, September 18, 1947, at exactly 9:15 p.m., to finalize plans for a campaign of church burnings and business bombings that would begin the following Monday. And they had been meeting for 37 minutes when the warehouse's rusted metal door swung open with a screech that cut through their conversation like a knife through flesh. And Ellsworth, Raymond Bumpy Johnson, walked in alone, wearing a charcoal wool suit and carrying nothing but a Louisville Slugger baseball bat that he held casually over his right shoulder, as if he were heading to a Sunday game in Central Park, rather than walking into a room containing 20 white supremacists who had just been discussing detailed plans to destroy everything he had built in Harlem over the past 15 years. The laughter started immediately, because the visual was absurd, comical even. One black man in an expensive suit walking into a warehouse full of Klansmen as if he owned the building and everyone in it, and Robert Bobby Whitmore, the 40th Grand Cyclops of this particular clavern who worked days as a foreman at a steel factory in the Bronx and nights as a recruiter for white supremacist violence, laughed so hard he had to bend over and brace his hands on his knees, and he said, between gasps, "Boys, you seeing what I'm seeing? This an asterisk, just walked in here by himself thinking he's going to do what exactly? Talk us out of burning down his little criminal empire." And the other 19 Klansmen laughed with him because Bobby Whitmore was absolutely correct that the situation was ridiculous, that one man, regardless of his reputation, could not possibly pose a threat to 20 armed white supremacists who between them had committed approximately 47 documented murders, 73 church burnings, and 118 acts of arson over the past 12 years, without facing a single criminal charge, because law enforcement in 1947 was either sympathetic to Klan objectives or too frightened of Klan retaliation to investigate their crimes. Bumpy Johnson stood 15 feet inside the warehouse door, perfectly still, letting the laughter wash over him like rain that doesn't touch skin. And he waited exactly 17 seconds for the laughter to peak and begin its natural decline before he spoke in a voice so quiet that the Klansmen had to stop laughing entirely just to hear what he was saying. "I received information 3 hours ago that 20 white men calling themselves defenders of racial purity were planning to burn 7 black churches in Harlem starting Monday morning, and I came here tonight to deliver a simple message, which is that Harlem is not the South. Harlem is not some rural county where you can terrorize black people without consequences. Harlem is my territory, and anyone who burns churches or bombs businesses in my territory will discover what happens when you mistake patience for weakness and silence for permission." The laughter resumed immediately because Bobby Whitmore and his 19 fellow Klansmen interpreted Johnson's calm delivery as evidence of fear disguised as bravado, as the kind of desperate bluffing that men engage in when they know they're outmatched but hope that words might accomplish what violence cannot. And Tommy Peterson, a 30-year-old Klan member who had personally burned 4 churches in Mississippi before moving to New York to escape a murder warrant, said, "Came here to deliver a message." Well, let me deliver one right back, which is that you got about 5 seconds to turn your black ass around and walk out that door before we show you what 20 white men can. Due to one uppity asterisk, who forgot his place. And the other Klansmen murmured agreement and began reaching for weapons they had brought specifically for this meeting. Knives and brass knuckles and tire irons and chains, because they anticipated that their church-burning campaign might provoke some resistance from Harlem's black community, and they wanted to be prepared to respond to that resistance with overwhelming force. Johnson shifted his weight slightly, a movement so small that most of the Klansmen didn't even notice it, but the 2 men standing closest to him James, Jimmy Crawford, and William Billy Ross. Both noticed, and both felt something shift in the atmosphere of the warehouse. Something primal and dangerous that their bodies recognized, even though their minds were still processing the absurdity of one man confronting 20, and Jimmy Crawford, who had been a Klansman for 19 years and had participated in enough violence to fill several prison sentences, said quietly to Billy Ross, "Something ain't right here. This an asterisk, 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 should be terrified, but he looks like he's calculating something." Billy Ross, who had only been a Klan member for 6 months and was still trying to prove his commitment to white supremacy through enthusiastic participation in violence, said, "He's just one man. What's he going to calculate except how fast he can run back out that door?" What Billy Ross did not understand, what none of the 20 Klansmen understood except maybe Jimmy Crawford, who was starting to feel the first tingling of genuine concern, was that Bumpy Johnson had spent the previous 3 hours not just learning about their meeting, but conducting detailed reconnaissance on every single person in this warehouse, knew their names and addresses and daily routines and family structures and financial vulnerabilities and criminal histories, knew that Bobby Whitmore had a gambling debt of $8,000 to a loan shark connected to the Genovese family, knew that Tommy Peterson was wanted for murder in Mississippi and living under an assumed identity, knew that 15 of the 20 men in this warehouse had criminal records that could be weaponized through strategic leaks to law enforcement, knew that the warehouse had only 2 exits, and both were now being watched by Frank, Lucas, and Unibird, who were positioned outside with shotguns and instructions to prevent anyone from leaving until Johnson gave the signal that his business was concluded. If you've ever watched someone walk into overwhelming odds with the kind of calm that comes from perfect preparation, if you've ever seen a master strategist turn numerical disadvantage into psychological dominance before violence even begins, subscribe and comment below about the most shocking moment you've witnessed when one person faced down a group and won. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes would become a legend told in Harlem barbershops for generations. The night Bumpy Johnson walked into a warehouse containing 20 Klansmen and walked out without a scratch, while those 20 men learned why you never, ever mistake one strategic mind for easy prey. Bobby Whitmore made the first move because leaders in hierarchical organizations like the Ku Klux Klan must maintain their authority through demonstrations of courage, even when that courage is actually stupidity wearing a white robe, and he pulled a hunting knife from his belt and took 3 steps toward Johnson, saying, "I'm going to carve my initials in your black face and send you back to Harlem as a warning about what happens to an asterisk, asterisk, asterisk ers who forget their place." This statement was intended to intimidate Johnson into retreat or panic, but instead Johnson did something that Bobby Whitmore had not anticipated, which was smile, not a nervous smile or a frightened smile, but a genuine smile of satisfaction. The smile of a man who has been waiting for permission to do what he already planned to do. And he said, "Thank you for making the first move. That makes everything that happens next legally self-defense." Then Bumpy Johnson moved. The baseball bat came off his shoulder in a fluid arc that had the weight of his entire body behind it, and it connected with Bobby Whitmore's right kneecap with a crack that sounded like a tree branch breaking in a windstorm, and Whitmore's leg bent sideways in a direction that human legs are not designed to bend, and he fell screaming to the warehouse floor with his hunting knife skittering away across concrete, and before any of the other 19 Klansmen could process what they had just witnessed, Johnson had already pivoted and brought the bat down on top of Tommy Peterson's skull, with enough force to fracture bone and cause immediate unconsciousness, and Peterson collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and the warehouse erupted into chaos as 19 remaining Klansmen realized simultaneously that they were not dealing with a frightened black man trying to talk his way out of trouble, but rather with a professional who had calculated exactly how to dismantle opponents in the most efficient sequence possible. The problem for the Klansmen was that they had gathered expecting a planning meeting followed perhaps by a celebratory cross-burning, not a fight for their lives against a man who had spent 15 years building a criminal empire through strategic violence, and who understood that winning fights was not about strength or numbers, but about speed and targeting and creating cascade failures where each disabled opponent reduces the effective force of everyone remaining. Jimmy Crawford understood this immediately because he had fought in World War II and recognized battlefield tactics when he saw them, and he shouted, "Don't rush him all at once. He's trying to create a bottleneck. Spread out and surround him." But his tactical advice came approximately 3 seconds too late, because the Klansmen closest to Johnson had already rushed forward in an uncoordinated mass, and Johnson used their momentum against them by stepping sideways and bringing the baseball bat across in a horizontal swing that caught William Ross full in the chest, breaking at least 3 ribs and knocking him backward into 2 other Klansmen who went down in a tangle of white robes and confusion. Johnson was now 4 Klansmen down in approximately 11 seconds, and the remaining 16 had finally spread out enough to create the kind of encirclement that should have overwhelmed any single opponent. But what they still did not understand was that Johnson was not fighting to win in the traditional sense of defeating every opponent. He was fighting to create enough fear and pain and disability that the group's collective will to continue fighting would collapse before his body gave out. And this required targeting specific individuals whose injuries would be so dramatic and terrifying that the other Klansmen would begin calculating whether their commitment to white supremacy was worth the risk of permanent disfigurement. The Klansmen were beginning to realize that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their assumption that numerical superiority guaranteed victory, and several of them were backing toward the walls of the warehouse, reconsidering their participation in this confrontation. But Jimmy Crawford, who had survived Normandy and understood that retreating from battle often leads to being shot in the back, shouted, "He's just one man with a bat. If we all rush him at once, he can't possibly stop all off. He's got to run out of stamina or we'll overwhelm him through sheer numbers." This was tactically correct, in theory, but it failed to account for the fact that Johnson was not relying solely on physical endurance, but rather on psychological warfare, on creating such graphic examples of what happens when you attack him that each successive Klansman would hesitate just a fraction of a second longer, and those accumulated fractions of hesitation would add up to decisive advantage. The coordinated rush that Jimmy Crawford ordered involved 7 Klansmen attacking simultaneously from different angles, which should have been impossible for one man to defend against. But Johnson had positioned himself near one of the burning barrels, and when the 7 men rushed forward he kicked the barrel over, spilling flaming debris across the warehouse floor, in a line that divided the attackers and forced 3 of them to jump or dodge, breaking their momentum and their coordination. The 4 who made it through the flames reached Johnson within a second of each other, close enough that they should have been able to grab him and pin him and beat him to death through sheer overwhelming force. But Johnson dropped the baseball bat entirely and pulled 2 pieces of rebar from his jacket that he had taken from a construction site on his way to the warehouse. Short lengths of steel approximately 14 inches long that fit perfectly in his hands and could be used like medieval maces to deliver devastating blows to soft tissue and bone. The first Klansman to reach him was a skinny man named Douglas "Doug" Fisher, who worked as a butcher and had assumed his knife skills would translate to combat effectiveness, and Johnson drove the rebar straight into Doug's solar plexus with enough force to rupture his diaphragm and collapse him to the floor, gasping for air that his body could no longer process. The second attacker was Patrick "Pat" Sullivan, who managed to grab Johnson's left arm. But Johnson spun into the grab rather than away from it, and brought the rebar in his right hand down on Pat's collarbone, with enough force to crack it, and Pat released his grip immediately and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. The third and fourth attackers, Marcus "Mark" Williams and Steve Davis, came from opposite sides trying to trap Johnson between them. But Johnson simply dropped to one knee, and they collided with each other above him, and he drove both pieces of rebar upward into their ribs simultaneously, cracking bones and causing enough pain that both men fell away from him, clutching their sides. 9 down, 11 remaining, 41 seconds, elapsed. Have you ever seen a group realize they've made a catastrophic miscalculation about an opponent's capabilities? If you've watched the moment when a mob's confidence transforms into fear because they understand they're not hunting prey, but confronting a predator, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next demonstrated exactly why Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem for decades, while these 20 Klansmen would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the night they learned that white robes don't provide protection from consequences. The psychological turning point came when Jimmy, who had been shouting tactical instructions from the relative safety of the warehouse's edge, made the mistake of stepping forward to join the fight himself, because he recognized that his men were losing not just the battle, but their nerve. And if someone didn't demonstrate leadership through personal courage, the remaining 11 Klansmen would break and run. Crawford had brought a tire iron to the meeting, and he approached Johnson with the careful deliberation of someone who has genuinely fought in real combat and understands that rushing gets you killed. And he said, "You're good. I'll give you that. Better than I expected. But you're breathing hard now, and you've got to be feeling the fatigue. And I've got 10 men behind me who are going to finish what we started tonight." This was an attempt to restore clan morale through confident prediction of victory. But Johnson looked directly at Crawford and said something that would be repeated in Harlem for the next 20 years. "I'm breathing hard because I'm excited, not tired, and the 10 men behind you are about to discover that supporting white supremacy isn't worth permanent disfigurement." Crawford swung the tire iron in a wide arc aimed at Johnson's head, a powerful blow that would have caused serious injury if it had connected. But Johnson ducked under it and drove his shoulder into Crawford's midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the concrete floor with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. And before Crawford could recover, Johnson brought the rebar down on his right hand, crushing the small bones that allow fingers to grip weapons, and the tire iron clattered away across the floor, and Crawford screamed and rolled away, cradling his destroyed hand against his chest. 10 down. 10 remaining. 53 seconds elapsed. The remaining 10 Klansmen were now facing a decision point that every mob faces when violence turns against them, which is whether to continue fighting and risk serious injury, or to retreat and live with the shame of having been defeated by a single opponent they had initially mocked. 6 of the 10 made the decision to retreat, backing toward the warehouse door while keeping their eyes on Johnson in case he pursued. But they discovered that the door would not open because Frank Lucas and Unibird had chained it from outside, following Johnson's prearranged signal, and their retreat was blocked. And they were trapped in a warehouse with a man who had just disabled 10 of their companions in less than a minute. The 4 who remained committed to fighting were the truest believers in Klan ideology, men who would rather die than admit defeat to a black man. And they included Richard "Ricky" Patterson, who had burned 7 churches in Alabama, Gregory "Greg" Barnes, who had lynched 3 black teenagers in Georgia, Samuel "Sam" Jenkins, who had bombed a black school in Tennessee, and Matthew "Matt" Wilson, who had murdered a black voting rights activist in Mississippi. These 4 men represented the absolute worst of white supremacist violence, men who had committed atrocities that would haunt their victims' families for generations, and they approached Johnson with the kind of hatred that transcends tactical thinking, that makes men willing to die if it means hurting the object of their hatred. Johnson understood that these 4 were different from the others, that they would not surrender or retreat, regardless of how much pain they experienced, and he shifted his strategy from disabling to destroying, from breaking bones to causing injuries so severe that these men would serve as permanent warnings to anyone else who considered bringing Klan violence to Harlem. Ricky Patterson rushed first, screaming racial slurs and swinging a chain that could crush skulls if it connected, and Johnson waited until the chain was at the top of its arc, and then stepped inside Patterson's reach and drove the rebar into his left eye with controlled precision, rupturing the eyeball and causing damage so severe that Patterson would be permanently blind in that eye and carry a scar that would disfigure half his face for the rest of his life. Gregory Barnes came next, having picked up Bobby Whitmore's hunting knife from where it had fallen earlier, and he slashed at Johnson's throat in a move designed to kill rather than disable. But Johnson caught Barnes's wrist mid-slash and twisted it backward until the wrist bones cracked and the knife dropped. And then he brought his knee up into Barnes's face with enough force to shatter his nose and cheekbones, and Barnes fell unconscious with a face that would require reconstructive surgery and would never look quite human again. Samuel Jenkins and Matthew Wilson attacked simultaneously from opposite sides, Jenkins with a brass knuckle punch aimed at Johnson's kidney, and Wilson with a kick aimed at Johnson's knee. And this coordinated attack should have succeeded, but Johnson dropped flat to the floor between them, and they struck each other instead. Jenkins's brass knuckle-enhanced fist connecting with Wilson's jaw and knocking out 3 teeth, Wilson's kick connecting with Jenkins's thigh, hard enough to cause a deep muscle bruise. And while they were recovering from hitting each other, Johnson swept Wilson's legs out from under him and brought the rebar down on his ankle, fracturing it so completely that Wilson would walk with a permanent limp. And then he rolled to Samuel Jenkins and drove the rebar into his rib cage, cracking for ribs and puncturing Jenkins's lung, causing him to collapse, gasping and choking on blood. 14 down, 6 remaining. 78 seconds elapsed. The 6 remaining Klansmen were the ones who had tried to retreat to the door and discovered it chained, and they were now pressed against the far wall of the warehouse, watching Johnson stand up from where he had been, fighting on the floor, watching him wipe blood from his face, though none of it was his own, watching him pick up the Louisville Slugger baseball bat he had dropped earlier and walk toward them with the unhurried pace of someone who has all the time in the world because his opponents have nowhere to run. One of the 6, a young man named Dave Coleman, who had joined the Klan only 3 months earlier because his father and grandfather had been members, started crying and said, "Please, I didn't even want to be here tonight. I just came because my dad said I had to. I never hurt nobody. Please, don't kill me." Johnson stopped 10 feet from the 6 remaining Klansmen and said, "I'm not going to kill anyone tonight because dead Klansmen can't spread the message I need spread, which is that Harlem is not Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia or any other place where white supremacist violence goes unpunished. Each of you is going to walk out of here alive but injured badly enough that every time you look in a mirror or feel pain when the weather changes or explain to your children why you limp or why you can't make a fist anymore, you'll remember this night, and you'll remember that you came to Harlem planning to burn churches and bomb businesses and terrorize black people. And instead you learned that some territories belong to people who will defend them with such perfect and terrible violence that you'll never dare return. If you were as shocked as these 6 Klansmen by the realization that numerical superiority means nothing against strategic brilliance, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you've ever witnessed someone completely dismantle a group's confidence through superior skill and planning. Because what Bumpy Johnson did in the next 2 minutes would ensure that the Ku Klux Klan never again attempted to operate openly in Harlem. Johnson broke Dave Coleman's right arm with the baseball bat, a clean fracture that would heal in 8 weeks, but would ache every winter for the rest of Coleman's life. He shattered Lawrence Larry Mitchell's kneecap, ensuring permanent mobility issues. He fractured Albert L. Henderson's jaw in 3 places, requiring it to be wired shut for 6 months. He crushed Robert Bob Taylor's hand, destroying the fine motor control necessary for his work as a machinist. He cracked Joseph Joe Murphy's collarbone, leaving him unable to lift his arm above his shoulder for the rest of his life. He broke Christopher Chris Anderson's ankle so thoroughly that Anderson would need surgery and would never run again. 20 down, 0 remaining uninjured. 147 seconds elapsed. Bumpy Johnson stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by 20 groaning, bleeding, broken Klansmen, and he pulled a white handkerchief from his jacket pocket and wiped the blood and sweat from his face and hands with the casual deliberation of someone who had just completed routine business rather than destroyed an entire Klavan. He walked to the warehouse door and knocked 3 times, and Frank, Lucas, and Unibird removed the chains from outside and opened the door. And Johnson walked out into the Harlem night at exactly 9:27 p.m., 12 minutes after he had entered, leaving behind 20 white supremacists who had come to that warehouse believing they would plan the destruction of Harlem's black community, and instead learned the hardest lesson of their lives about the difference between racial hatred and actual power. Subscribe for more stories about strategic violence that changed the balance of power in American cities. Comment below if you've ever seen one person dismantle a group's entire worldview through perfect execution. The aftermath of that night rippled through both white supremacist networks and Harlem's black community in ways that would reshape the dynamics of racial violence in New York for the next 2 decades. The 20 Klansmen who limped and crawled and dragged themselves out of that warehouse on 142nd Street required a combined total of 147 stitches, 16 casts, 7 surgeries, and 3 reconstructive procedures. Not a single one of them filed a police report because doing so would have required explaining why they were meeting in a warehouse in Harlem to plan church burnings and business bombings, and even in 1947 New York, that kind of admission would have resulted in at least some criminal charges, especially since several of them were wanted for crimes committed in southern states. Instead, the story spread through underground channels, whispered in white supremacist meetings across New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, told as a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate your opposition, when you assume that racial superiority translates to combat effectiveness, when you bring numerical advantage to a fight against someone who has spent 15 years building power through strategic violence and perfect execution. The Ku Klux Klan never again attempted to establish a public presence in Harlem, never again held recruitment meetings in Manhattan, never again planned coordinated campaigns of terror against black New Yorkers, because the cost of doing so had been demonstrated with such brutal clarity that even the most committed white supremacists understood that Harlem was protected by someone who would not negotiate a compromise or accept white terrorism as an inevitable feature of American life. In Harlem's black community, the story of that night became legend almost immediately. The details were embellished and expanded in the way that all legendary stories grow, with some versions claiming Johnson fought 30 Klansmen, others claiming he used exotic weapons, still others claiming the fight lasted an hour, but the core truth remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had walked alone into a warehouse containing 20 armed white supremacists who were planning to burn black churches, and he had walked out 12 minutes later without a scratch while those 20 men learned that Harlem was not the South, that black people in Harlem had protectors who would respond to white terrorism with such overwhelming force that future attacks became unthinkable. The barbershops on Lenox Avenue and 125th Street told the story for months, each barber adding his own details and interpretations. And younger men who heard those stories understood that Johnson's victory was not just about physical combat, but about establishing boundaries, about demonstrating that some communities would defend themselves with whatever violence was necessary to prevent the kind of church burnings and bombings that terrorized black communities throughout the South. The beauty parlors on 135th Street told the story to their clients, and black women who had lived in fear of white violence found comfort in knowing that, at least in Harlem, at least in this one neighborhood, in this one city, there was someone who would fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. The strategic brilliance of what Johnson had done that night was not just in the violence itself, but in the message it sent about power and protection. By fighting alone rather than bringing his entire crew, he had demonstrated that Harlem's defense did not require mobilizing hundreds of people or creating an army or engaging in the kind of organized violence that would have triggered massive police response. One man with perfect preparation and ruthless execution could defend an entire community against white supremacists' terror. And that demonstration changed how both black and white New Yorkers thought about the possibilities of resistance. The churches that the Klansmen had planned to burn on Monday morning held their services without incident and continued holding services for the next 70 years without ever experiencing the kind of arson attacks that destroyed hundreds of black churches across the South during the Civil Rights era. The businesses that the Klansmen had targeted for bombing remained open and profitable, protected by the knowledge that anyone who attacked them would face consequences more severe than any court would impose. The families who lived in Harlem's tenements and brownstones and apartment buildings went about their lives with one less fear, knowing that white supremacist violence would not go unanswered, that terror would be met with terror, that some boundaries would be defended regardless of cost. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about what happened in that warehouse on September 18, 1947, maintaining the same silence about that night that he maintained about most of his strategic operations. But everyone who worked with him understood that the silence was not shame or regret, but rather professional discretion, the recognition that explaining your victories diminishes their power, that mystery amplifies legend, that allowing people to imagine the details creates more lasting fear than recounting those details ever could. 20 years later, when Johnson died of a heart attack at age 62 while eating breakfast at a Harlem restaurant, the newspaper obituaries mentioned his criminal record and his involvement in the numbers racket and his conflicts with other gangsters, but they did not mention the night he walked into a warehouse containing Klansmen and walked out 12 minutes later, having single-handedly prevented a campaign of white supremacist terror. That story remained in Harlem's oral tradition, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes one person with perfect preparation and ruthless execution can accomplish what entire movements cannot. That strategic violence delivered at the right moment against the right targets can reshape power dynamics in ways that negotiation and compromise never achieve. The baseball bat Johnson used that night was never found, having been disposed of in the East River along with the 2 pieces of rebar and the blood-stained handkerchief and any other evidence that could have connected him to what happened in that warehouse. The Klansmen who survived that night scattered to different cities and states, none of them remaining in New York, most of them telling no one about their injuries, except to claim they had been in car accidents or construction mishaps or bar fights, unable to admit that they had been destroyed by a single black man they had initially mocked for showing up alone to confront their numerical superiority. The warehouse itself was demolished 6 months later to make room for a housing development, erasing the physical location where the confrontation occurred but not erasing the memory of what happened there, which persisted in Harlem's collective consciousness as proof that some people cannot be intimidated by numbers or threats or white robes, that some territories will be defended with such perfect and terrible violence that attacking them becomes unthinkable, that sometimes the most important. Victories are the ones that prevent future battles by demonstrating so completely what will happen to anyone who dares to start them. And in barber shops and beauty parlors and church basements across Harlem for the next 50 years, whenever someone young and frustrated asked why they couldn't fight back against injustice, couldn't respond to racism with violence, couldn't defend their community the way their grandparents supposedly had, the older generation would tell them about the night Bumpy Johnson walked into a warehouse containing 20 Klansmen who thought it was funny when he showed up solo, and how 10 minutes later not one of those Klansmen was smiling, and how that single act of strategic violence protected Harlem from white supremacist terror for decades, and how sometimes one person who refuses to accept that numerical superiority determines outcomes can accomplish more than entire movements by demonstrating with perfect clarity exactly what consequences await anyone who mistakes patience for weakness or silence for permission.